Hi, I'm Zander.
I'm Blaise.
And I'm John.
We're at the Santa Barbara Middle School Team Press, and today we're interviewing.
SOFIAN KHAN.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
So how did you first find this film?
So my partner, co-producer, co-director, Andres, who you should also talk to, is also a radio reporter, a producer for StoryCorps, which is an NPR distributed radio program. And they were doing a Military Voices series, and he encountered Paul and Philip. Philip Morris, codename Philip Morris, an interpreter, and Sergeant Braun, Paul Braun, who was his, commanding officer. Well, not exactly. He was military, and then he was a interpreter who,
Okay.
Philip Morris worked for the U.S. And so we found them, and sort of it all grew out from there. Basically, their friendship and the story of how Philip worked with the U.S. and then was in danger as a result of that. Had to leave Iraq and a very difficult visa process, and Paul helped him as a friend and as someone who appreciated his service.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you explain why it is so difficult for Iraqis and Afghans interpreters to get visas to come to the U.S.?
It's a very complicated issue. There's a lot of red tape involved. So basically, they're extremely well vetted when they're actually coming into employment with the U.S. So they go through a whole background security clearance process. But then when they're applying for the visa, they go through an even more rigorous process, and that has a lot of loopholes in it. There's a lot of issues within that process. So even though there's this special immigrant visa available, it's such a rigorous process that it takes very long time. There's a lot of names that sort of get caught up in the system, incorrectly labeled or blacklisted. It's just a very complicated issue. Yeah.
Are the interpreters ever forgiven by the people in their countries who feel that they have betrayed them?
That's a great question. I think probably a large amount of the populace doesn't necessarily see them as traitors. I mean, there are a lot of people who are just average citizens who are just trying to get along, and they see interpreters as fellow Iraqis or fellow Afghans who are doing a job. But there, of course, are these militants, there are insurgents, there are other people who disagree with what those people have decided to do. And I would say it's a tough situation. I mean, Taliban, you're not really going to find the Taliban forgiving interpreters. They consider them to be, infidels essentially, and that they have the right to just kill them. So it's a very difficult scenario for interpreters to know who amongst their own people to trust and who to believe that they're okay with me doing this job, or are they actually harboring ill intent towards me. Yeah.
So with all these risks and being kind of pointed at from the terrorists, why do these people become...
Why did they do the job?
Yeah, why do they do the job?
Yeah. So some people who joined up early in the war, when there was a more optimistic feel, for example in Afghanistan, the Taliban left very rapidly. So in the film we follow Malik, who is one of a very early hire that the U.S. hired him. He was within, I think, the first few hundred interpreters who were actually hired in the country. Wow. He happened to live near the Air Force base. He believed that things were going to be great. He thought that this was a new chapter for Afghanistan, the end of the war, Taliban's gone. So he joined with that in mind. Obviously didn't turn out that way. Things got really bad.
Yeah.
He's now had to leave the country. Now for guys joining up later on, of course they know that there's a security danger, there's a security threat, but it's a good job. and it's something to survive off of. And in an economy that's otherwise quite broken, the U.S. is one of the biggest employers, and or was when we were there in great numbers, was a major employer, major source of economic support for Iraqis and Afghans.
How does the U.S. work with the interpreters after they are not needed anymore? They just can't help them anymore, because they pulled out before.
Yeah, so they essentially, when the U.S. started to draw down troop presence, they started just letting go of interpreters. If you hadn't worked for at least a year in good standing, you could not apply for the visa. So there were some guys who had joined up, and also you had to have worked for 1 year for one company or directly with the U.S. Army. So it's also a complicated situation where some people's employment records, where they may have worked for 6 or 7 months with one company, moved to another, and cumulatively worked as an interpreter for years, but they never had 1 full year of consistent with one entity. So those guys actually also got caught up in not being able to apply. So really, yeah, there's no support for anyone unless they fit the criteria. And then in Iraq, the program's over, so you can't apply anymore as an interpreter. It's only in Afghanistan. Yeah.
How do you feel about the American military pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think it's a major. Obviously, the situation has gotten worse in both places. Security situation. Iraq, not less so. Afghanistan, much more. Iraq now is sort of turned around after pushing ISIS back, but immediately after the U.S. left, it did leave a vacuum, and ISIS filled that vacuum. So I think departing, you can ask the larger question of should we have been there in the first place. But departing maybe could have been done differently. Maybe it was politically motivated to sort of pull out a certain fashion that left too much of a vacuum. But it's a complicated question. Personally, my own personal feeling towards the wars is that if we'd focused on Afghanistan and done the job correctly there instead of spreading the war to Iraq, that we would have probably been able to do something and make some progress and stabilize that country. Instead, we went into Iraq under false pretenses, and that completely destroyed our focus and ability to make Afghanistan stable. So it's just whether now that you've made that mistake, do you just stay in there forever? That's really the alternative.
When has your film come out, and if so, where can other people see it?
Mm-hmm. So this was our world premiere of our festival for the film, and now we're going to be doing more festivals, so we'll be touring around the country, and on our website, interpretersdoc.com, we'll have upcoming screenings, so you can see if it's coming to your city. But then the bigger picture for us is actually television broadcast. So we're funded by ITVS, which is part of the PBS family, and basically it's going to go to PBS broadcast at some date to be determined. So hopefully that will be, if you follow us on interpretersdoc.com and you want to see the film, you're not in a place where the festival's circuit is going to take us, we'll be able to give you an update as to when it's going to be available both on television, and then it does stream digitally online as well.
Okay, thank you.
Last question. If you could give us one homework assignment, what would that be?
Okay. You guys are studying journalism, right? It might be interesting to see if in Santa Barbara that you guys have any interpreters who've been settled there, and maybe locate them and ask them, talk to them about the film and learn a little bit about their experience, and maybe write a little something about it. They've been settled all over the country, so I run into interpreters occasionally, or people who, new interpreters, especially veterans, of course, who worked with them. But they're here, they're the ones that made it. So maybe you guys can find out more about that in your locality.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Thanks for watching the film.